Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brood Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to tell you this every single time. I don't think you realize how important it is and how much it means to me that you're here, that you're tuned in, you're listening, you're watching. You're literally helping a guy chase a childhood dream and try and turn a passion into a career. So, sincerely, thank you so much for being here. I mean that. This is episode 5, episode 5 of the Basement Brood Fantasy Football podcast. Episode 2 was a fantasy football deep dive into the Buffalo Bills. Episode 3 was a fantasy football deep dive into the Miami Dolphins. And episode 4 was all about the New England Patriots. By the way, when I'm doing these full-blown fantasy football previews and these fantasy football breakdowns, I'm making them available in whichever format, whichever method you choose and you prefer to consume your content. So if you're a reader, all of these are available in article form on my website. Just go to basementbroodff.com, click on content, bam, you're going to get every single article that I've ever written right there. If you prefer YouTube, maybe you're already watching this on YouTube, but if you're listening to this via podcast, you can hop right over to YouTube and all of my episodes, this episode, all of my previous episodes, everything's over there on YouTube, and vice versa. If you're currently watching this on YouTube, but you actually prefer podcast, search Basement Brood Fantasy Football anywhere you listen to podcasts, which is, Apple iTunes or Spotify. I felt like such a dad, such a grandpa when I just said Apple iTunes. You get what I'm saying. All of this stuff is available wherever, however you choose however you choose and however you prefer to consume your content. Now, today is episode 5, and if you haven't guessed it by now, we are going to wrap up our fantasy football preview of the AFC East with the New York Jets. As always, the link to the article that I already published is right below in the description of this episode. Or again, you can just go to basementbroodff.com and click on content. Before we dive into what they're going to look like from a 2022 standpoint, it always makes sense to take a look at where they're coming from and take a look at 2021. And if we're being honest, 2021 was more of a plane crash than a Jets team that's ready to take flight. Overall, they finished 28th in points scored, averaging about 18 per game. They finished 26th in yards gained, getting about 306 per game. 28th in plays run, averaging just about 61 per game. They finished 26th in first downs at about 18 per game. And they finished 28th in scoring percentage, scoring on just 29.4% of their offensive drives. And if that wasn't enough, they also had the 5th most turnovers in football with 27. Through the air, they had the 13th most passing attempts at 35-ish per game, but even though they were the 13th most passing attempts and the 13th most passing-heavy team in football, they only finished 20th in passing yards at about 208 per game, 28th in touchdowns at just 20, and they had the 2nd most interceptions also at 20. On the ground, from a rushing standpoint, they were the least rushing heavy, so I guess the most rushing light. Doesn't really work that way, but they were the least rushing heavy offense in football. They had the fewest rushing attempts at 22 per game. They had the 6th fewest rushing yards at about 98 per game. They had the 4th fewest rushing first downs at just about 5 per game. Now, encouragingly, from a rushing standpoint, they did actually score 14 rushing touchdowns, which is still the 14th fewest in football, but when you consider that they ran the ball fewer than any other team in the NFL, finishing 14th fewest actually is somewhat encouraging. And to add on top of that, they actually had the 10th best yards per carry at 4.4 yards per carry, which was the 10th best in football. Still, despite that little sliver, that little hint of optimism, it was definitely a year to forget for the Jets. It was a year to forget for Jets fans, but let's add a little bit of context here. Now, for starters, it was their head coach, Robert Saleh's first appearance, his first season as a head coach. Their offense was largely led by rookies. They had a rookie quarterback in Zach Wilson. They had a rookie running back in Michael Carter. They had a rookie wide receiver 1 in Elijah Moore, maybe wide receiver 2, depending on how you view Corey Davis. But it was an offense that was largely fueled by kids fresh out of college. On top of that, Zach Wilson missed 4 games. Michael Carter missed 3 games. Elijah Moore missed 6 games. And then Tevin Coleman, Jamison Crowder, Corey Davis, Ryan Griffin, and Tyler Kroft, all of which were starters for the Jets last year, combined to miss 30 games. So yeah, when you're missing your entire offense, you're probably not going to put up a lot of points. You're not going to put up a whole heck of a lot of statistics. So 2021 was filled with turbulence, but 2022's Jets might finally be ready to take flight. They are largely considered by many, not just in the fantasy football community, but in the football community at large, at least by what I've seen on Twitter and several articles and just basic general chatter that I've seen on the Jets Reddit, for example, or overall Reddit, that the Jets are widely considered to have had the best draft in the entire NFL. They added talent all over the place. They boosted Zach Wilson's arsenal. And it's an offense that might finally be ready to get off the ground. Granted, when you're on the ground, there's really no other direction to go plus up. But they used the 10th overall pick on Ohio State's Garrett Wilson, a very capable wide receiver that should make an impact immediately. They brought in the best running back in this year's rookie draft class. They used the 36th overall pick on Iowa State's Breece Hall. And they completely remodeled their tight end room. They brought in Tyler Conklin and CJ Uzomah. Less exciting names, not necessarily a huge splash there by any means, but still both of those guys, Tyler Conklin and CJ Uzomah, are they're upgrades on Ryan Griffin and Tyler Kroft. So no matter which way you slice it, the Jets upgraded the tight end room, brought in another capable running back, and added Garrett Wilson, a very, very talented wide receiver, to the mix. So they are doing everything that they can. They're going to get Elijah Moore back healthy. Corey Davis is going to be healthy. Zach Wilson is returning for his second year. Robert Saleh. All 4 of those guys are going to be in their second year of meshing together, and that can't be a bad thing, right? That's a heck of a lot easier than your first year of trying to work together. Now, the bad news. Let's start with Zach Wilson. The bad news, obviously, no surprises here. Last year was very, very ugly, right? He played in 12 fantasy football games, and when I say that, that means weeks 1 to 17. He played in 12 of those contests and averaged just 11.83 fantasy points per game, which was good enough, I guess I shouldn't say, for QB 29. He was the QB 29 in fantasy football last year. He finished 30th in passing yards, 31st in touchdowns. He had just 8 touchdowns in 12 games, but he had 11 interceptions. Brutal. In those 12 games that Zach Wilson played, he never once hit 24 fantasy points. He hit 20 fantasy points just 16.7% of the time, and he crashed under 10 fantasy points in 33.3% of his games. So I'll say that again. He hit 20 points in about 17% of his games, and he finished under 10 points in 33% of his games. Brutal. Now, the good news, like I mentioned earlier, there's only one direction to go for Zach Wilson and the Jets, and that's up, right? So in the 2 games that Wilson did hit 20 points, those games came later in the season. They came in weeks 13 and 16, leaving one to wonder, maybe he's starting to figure it out, right? The first half of the season is a slump, but the back half of the season, he starts to flash a little bit, putting up 20 fantasy points twice in 4 weeks between weeks 13 and 16. He's also, like we mentioned before, he's getting back a healthy and another year progressed of Elijah Moore. He's getting back a healthy Corey Davis. We're adding Garrett Wilson to the mix. They upgraded that tight end room. They added, the draft's best back in Breece Hall. There's no other way to slice it. The arrow is pointing straight up on Zach Wilson. Yes, we know he's at the ground floor. It can't get much worse than it was last year. But the arrow's pointing up, and there's room, there's reasons for excitement, there's reasons for optimism for Zach Wilson and for the Jets' offense as a whole. He will not have excuses to fall back on after the Jets have basically revamped his entire, artillery moving forward. Now, as for fantasy football drafts, Zach Wilson is currently the 22nd quarterback off the board, drafted around pick 169, which is the 15th round. He's drafted behind guys like Trevor Lawrence, Jameis Winston, Matt Ryan, Daniel Jones. He's notably drafted ahead of guys like Mac Jones, Ryan Tannehill, Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, and Baker Mayfield. Currently in your typical one quarterback league where you can make maneuvers, you can make trades and adds and drops, I'm not even touching Zach Wilson. I'm not bothering. It's not worth a pick in your typical one quarterback league. In a Superflex league, obviously he's very much on the radar. He's somebody that should be rostered in Superflex or two quarterback leagues. I would treat him more as a bottom barrel quarterback too, and probably even better to treat him as a high-end QB3 for Superflex leagues. And as for best ball leagues, I'm sprinkling in some exposure to Zach Wilson where I can, but I'm also sprinkling in equal parts Mac Jones, Ryan Tannehill, Carson Wentz. All of those names are guys that come after Zach Wilson. So to me, they're in a very similar tier, and a lot of those guys can be taken after Zach Wilson. Hopping over to the backfield, one of the more interesting dilemmas in fantasy football, in 2022 fantasy football, is Breece Hall and how expensive he is and whether or not he's worthy of that draft pick. Quick sip of Summer Shandy. No, this is not a advertisement for Leinenkugels. Maybe it should be someday, but I am dehydrated in Wisconsin, and beer is the only way to fix that. All right, so let's talk Breece Hall, and to a lesser extent, let's talk Michael Carter. Now, Michael Carter last season, his rookie campaign, he actually had a very solid rookie campaign. He averaged about 11.7 PPR points per game. He finished as the RB28, so kind of a high-end RB3, high-end flex player, if you will. And he was doing it just part-time. He was splitting time with Tevin Coleman. He finished 17th among running backs in targets with 52. He finished 16th in receiving yards with 325. And he occasionally flashed some really important weekly upside. He was able to hit 15 or more PPR points in 23.1% of his games, and he actually even topped 30 points once in Week 8. But then the high hopes for Michael Carter and all of his dynasty managers kind of came crashing down when the Jets used the 36th overall pick on Breece Hall, who's widely considered to be this year's best running back, and it's not even close. Like, he's in a tier of his own as far as running backs go. He's a legit 3-down type of running back who could very easily be a workhorse in the NFL. But that said, it's not very likely that Michael Carter just disappears, right? The Jets used a 4th-round draft pick on him last year. He led the team in carries. He paced the backfield last year with 43% of the running back's targets. We know he's a capable pass catcher. So I'm not expecting Breece Hall to just waltz right into this, superhero Adrian Peterson type of every down role. Instead, I'm expecting more of a 1A and 1B type of approach where Breece Hall is the clear-cut 1A and he gets the early down work. But I think, Michael Carter is going to stay involved as a 1B type, and he should have the early edge on passing down work, having, a whole year under his belt and proving himself as a capable pass catcher. So that brings us to the dilemma, which is current early fantasy football drafts. Breece Hall is being drafted as the RB19 at pick 45, which is the late 4th round. The cost itself is completely fine. RB19, that's fine. Late 4th round, that's fine. All of that is completely fine, especially for a potential workhorse. But if you're like me and you believe he won't be the immediate workhorse and Michael Carter is going to be involved, that makes Breece Hall really, really, really difficult to take in 2022 fantasy football leagues, especially when he's in that RB dead zone between rounds 3 and 6. And the reason it's an RB dead zone is because, historically a lot of running backs kind of fail and bust in that, rounds 3 to 6 range. But on the other side of the coin, you look at the wide receivers that are available in the late 4th, and it's really hard to pass on those guys. We're talking Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin, Jerry Jeudy, Allen Robinson, DK Metcalf, Gabriel Davis, if you're into that sort of thing, depending on how you feel about Gabriel Davis. I talked about him at ad nauseum in episode 2, if you want to rewind and go back and check out my thoughts on Gabriel Davis. And that's not even including other positions, by the way. Also available in the late 4th is usually guys like Darren Waller, Cam Akers, Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes. There's just a lot of competition at the spot where Breece Hall is usually drafted. To be frank, I'm more often than not, I have very, very, very small exposure to Breece Hall here in 2022, and I'm more often than not, I'm opting for one of those wide receivers that I mentioned just a few seconds ago. Michael Carter, on the other hand, he is drafted as the 46th running back off the board around pick 143, which is in the 12th round. He, to me, is a solid 0 RB pick as a pass catcher who could find himself in a much larger role if something were to happen to Breece Hall. He's another one of those guys where it is difficult to draft him as well because he, too, is drafted around some names that are hard to pass up, like Darrell Henderson, Devontae Parker, Van Jefferson, Robert Tonyan, Albert O, Hunter Henry. There's a lot of options there, but even still, I have plenty of Michael Carter in my portfolio this year, and I do really like him in that range in best ball leagues. Now, as for dynasty leagues, Breece Hall is the, I want to say, unquestioned 1.01, largely because most fantasy football players believe that he's the unquestioned 1.01 in rookie drafts. Personally, I wouldn't fault anybody, and I think there's a case that could be made for Drake London at 1.01, but that's an unpopular opinion. Breece Hall is the 1.01. He is who I would take if I had the 1.01 in rookie drafts, but he's not as surefire. He's not as clear-cut as some historic 1.01s like Najee Harris and Saquon Barkley and guys like that. So if I have the 1.01, which, by the way, I did as of an hour ago, I'm putting it on the trading block just to see what comes around. So, fun story, literally as I was writing up my show notes here, in the middle of that, I ended up trading away the 1.01 pick. I traded away 101, a.k.a. Breece Hall. So I traded away Breece Hall, Chris Godwin, 1.06, and then a third rounder next year. And I brought in Kyle Pitts, Cortland Sutton, 2.06, and a second rounder next year. Pretty balanced, pretty even trade. If you ask me, I'd say it's about as even as it gets. But, I'm in a position where I'm heavy at running back. Didn't need another Breece Hall type, but I did need a tight end, and who better to get in Dynasty than Kyle Pitts? So very solid trade. Shout out to you, Greg Quirk. Thanks for the back and forth on quote unquote negotiating. But anyway, if I have the 1.01 in Dynasty leagues, I'm gonna at least put it on the trading block and see what kind of offers I get, especially since I know that there's bigger, better Breece Hall truthers out there than me, or I'm not the biggest truther. Dynasty leagues, Michael Carter, just a hold. You can't really sell him. If you do, you're selling him low and you're going to get a minimal return anyway. So just hang on to him and hope his value picks up as the year goes on. All right, let's hop over to the Jets wide receiver room, which is it's more interesting from a fantasy football standpoint. It's one of the more interesting wide receiver rooms in all of football. Last year, as a rookie, Elijah Moore finished as the wide receiver 34, averaging about 12.6 PPR points per game. His teammate Corey Davis finished as the wide receiver 38, averaging about 11.7 PPR points per game, so less than 1 point per game on average. Elijah Moore was able to hit 20 PPR points in 27.3% of his games, and Corey Davis was able to do the same in 22.2% of his games. These guys were nearly identical when they were on the field together. They played 7 games together, nearly identical. Elijah Moore averaged 11.2 PPR points per game. Corey Davis averaged 11.1. Elijah Moore had 7.6 targets. Corey Davis had 6.4 targets. Elijah Moore averaged 3.7 catches. Corey Davis averaged 3.7 catches. Elijah Moore averaged 48.7 yards. Corey Davis averaged 48 yards. Both guys had 3 touchdowns. They were nearly identical. So Elijah Moore's floor, he scored under 9 PPR points in the first 4 games that they played together, but he averaged 20.4 PPR points in the other 3 games. Likewise, Corey Davis scored under 10 points 4 times, but averaged 18.6 in the other 3 games. So these guys were basically a spitting image of each other statistically and from a fantasy football standpoint, at least during the time that they were on the field together. Now they're adding Garrett Wilson to the mix, who's not cheap. He's, they spent the 10th overall pick on Garrett Wilson to bring him in. He's going to play early. He's going to demand targets. He's going to throw a wrench into the whole target pecking order and the target totem pole. Now, the Jets did just vacate 185-plus targets with the departures of Jamison Crowder, Keelan Cole, Ryan Griffin, Tyler Kroft. 67 of those targets were tight end targets, but still, there's plenty of targets to go around for Garrett Wilson to at least fit into the mix, and all 3 guys to be relevant if Zach Wilson is able to take a step forward. The likely problem and the likely scenario is that you won't be able to count on any one of those guys on a consistent week-to-week basis. It's going to be the sort of thing where they kind of take turns having fantasy-relevant games. My money would be on Elijah Moore to be the most fantasy football relevant, but it seems the public agrees as well. If we look at fantasy drafts, early summer fantasy drafts, Elijah Moore is currently drafted as the wide receiver 32 around pick 68. That's the 6th round. He's completely fine at that cost, and I've taken him there myself many times, but he's also in a very competitive spot where he's being drafted in the vicinity of Chris Godwin, Jalen Hurts if you're into that, Amari Cooper, A.J. Dillon, Antonio Gibson, Adam Thielen, Russell Gage, DeAndre Hopkins, Miles Sanders, and more. It's a very competitive spot and a very competitive place that Elijah Moore is being drafted. And then despite similar outputs, so remember, Elijah Moore and Corey Davis were basically twins when they were on the field together last year. Elijah Moore is being drafted as the wide receiver 32. Corey Davis is being drafted as the wide receiver 70 around pick 160, which is in the 14th round. I recognize that he's the odd man out with all the remodeling that they've done and bringing Garrett Wilson in. I recognize that he's the odd man out, but wide receiver 70 is an absolute bargain for Corey Davis. There's several wide receivers that are drafted ahead of him that have no business being drafted ahead of him. Mecole Hardman, Jamison Williams, Jahan Dotson, Van Jefferson, Joshua Palmer, KJ Osborne, Jalen Tolbert, DJ Chark, and ironically enough, Garrett Wilson himself, who definitely could make a case should be drafted ahead of Corey Davis, but I don't think it's as clear-cut as it seems. And then other positions. He's also being drafted behind Khalil Herbert, Tyron Davis-Price, Gus Edwards. He is just one of the screaming values in fantasy football drafts in 2022. No doubt in my mind that he's going to exceed wide receiver 70, and he's going to demolish that cost. If you haven't guessed it by now, Corey Davis is my favorite 14th round pick, and frankly, it's not even close. Garrett Wilson, he is being drafted around wide receiver 51, which is pick 110 in the 10th round. Now, he's like Corey Davis, he's likely to outscore his standing. He's likely to outscore wide receiver 51, but he, like Elijah Moore, he's drafted in a very competitive spot. He's drafted within the same picks as, Melvin Gordon, Aaron Rodgers, Chase Claypool, Derek Carr, James Cook, Zach Ertz, Chase Edmonds, Tyler Boyd, Ramondre Stevenson, Kirk Cousins, Christian Watson, Tim Patrick, Michael Gallup, and Rondale Moore. Several of those names that I listed off are guys that I would take, and I have taken over Wilson time and time again. I've taken almost zero Garrett Wilson up to this point, but I should admit that I am planning on placing a concentrated focus and a concentrated effort on adding some Garrett Wilson to my fantasy football portfolio before the summer's over. And by the way, to be clear, I am in no way saying that Corey Davis is better than Garrett Wilson. That is not at all what I'm saying. Fantasy football is a game of extracting value, and when you look at the draft boards currently, Corey Davis's value is insane, whereas Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson come at prices that are much more expected and much more acceptable for the type of player that they am. Corey Davis is way underdrafted. Dynasty leagues real quick. Elijah Moore is a hold. He's possibly even a buy low if the current Elijah Moore manager in your league is nervous about Wilson coming in and being this alpha that takes all of the targets. It's worth putting out some feelers and seeing if you can land Elijah Moore. The kid's going to be a stud. Corey Davis, definite buy low. We just talked about him as the wide receiver 70. He's, if you have him, hang on to him, and if you don't, place some offers and try and get him for cheap. I wonder if you can get him for like a third-round pick or something. And then last but not least, Garrett Wilson. He is my 1.05 in rookie drafts. I have him as the wide receiver 4 in rookie drafts, and there will be more content on that coming out as the summer goes along. All right, let's hop over to the Jets tight end room, and then we will wrap it up there. We'll wrap it up the AFC East. First, another drink of my non-sponsored summer shandy. All right. So, mentioned before, the Jets completely remodeled their tight end room. They got rid of Ryan Griffin. They got rid of Tyler Kroft. They brought in 26-year-old Tyler Conklin from Minnesota. And they brought in 29-year-old CJ Uzomah from Cincinnati, fresh off a Super Bowl appearance. In his career, CJ Uzomah has never hit 65 targets, 50 catches, or 500 yards. Tyler Conklin did that last year alone. 87 targets, 61 catches, 593 yards. There are 67 vacated tight end targets in the Jets offense. That's not a lot. It's certainly not likely that either of these guys are going to be super relevant from a fantasy football standpoint. But this is a vastly improved tight end room, and it's safe to wonder whether or not they as a whole can accumulate more than 67 targets just based on how talented they are compared to the tight ends from last year. Don't get me wrong, both guys are nothing more than unexciting tight end threes, TE3s. I do like Tyler Conklin to outscore CJ Uzomah in 2022 and beyond, which is interesting because CJ Uzomah is currently drafted ahead of Tyler Conklin. So CJ Uzomah is drafted as the TE32, which is totally fine. He goes in the 18th round, which is probably too expensive, to be honest. Tyler Conklin's the TE34, and he's usually available in the 20th round. Now, to be clear, if you're in a regular redraft league, you're in a regular fantasy football league, a one tight end fantasy football league, these guys are keep them off the radar. Don't even think about them. But if you're in best ball leagues like me, usually by the time these guys come up in the conversation, I'm done drafting tight ends. I've already, grabbed my 2 or 3. But every now and then, I'll find myself in a position where I could really use a third tight end, and in that case, Tyler Conklin's actually one of my favorite, if not my favorite, 20th round, last round draft picks. I think there's at least a tiny, tiny bit of upside and a chance that he has a couple fantasy football relevant weeks. That is a wrap on the New York Jets. That is a wrap on the AFC East. I have not yet decided on which division and which route I'm going to go next, but there is, like I mentioned earlier on the podcast, there is podcast form, article form, YouTube form, anything that you could possibly want for Patriots, Bills, Dolphins, and Jets. And as you know, the rest are coming down the line as the summer goes on. The link to the Jets article that further dives into what we talked about today is in the description of this episode. While you're over on the website, you'll probably be greeted by a pop-up that offers to join our email list. Highly recommend it so you don't miss anything moving forward. My only ask, if you're open to it, is wherever you're listening to this, please give it a like, give it a subscribe, leave a review if you can. And think if you can share this with just one other person. Is there one other person that you know that would enjoy this type of content? I promise you it doesn't sound like a big deal to you, but it is huge for me. If you can think of even just one person to share this with, please consider it. All that's left, I guess, come, if you're over on Twitter, that's usually where I'm doing most of my hanging out and talking fantasy football. You can find me at BBFFMikey. The next time you hear from me, I'm actually going to be dropping a short episode, just a really short episode introducing you to best ball leagues if you're not familiar. There's been a couple requests for that. And after that, I'm going to be, dropping my fantasy football draft kits next week. Those are coming out next week. They're going to be available for sale. I'll have several previews, and we'll be talking about that on the podcast, I'm sure. And after that, of course, we're going to resume the team-by-team previews. Again, haven't quite decided which team and which division I'm going to go with next. If you have any suggestions and requests, now I feel like a DJ, but if you have any requests, shoot them my way. I'm happy to give some thought to who I should cover next. So that's it for today. That's a wrap on the Jets. That's a wrap on the AFC East, and that is a wrap on today's podcast. Really hope you enjoyed it. Again, thank you so dang much for being here. You have no idea what you're doing for me and for my life and for my family and what I'm trying to do before I go to my grave in several decades, hopefully. So thank you so much for being here. Cheers. This brew's for you.